So I'm going to start recording now. Welcome to folks who are joining via the recording.
Rob, this is Jeannie Choi. I just had a question about the recordings. How can we access them if we miss a call?
Aha, that's a very good question. So let me show you the easy way of doing it. So there is a YouTube channel that I post them to after the calls. So if you go to Linked Art, there is a link at the bottom to the front page to the YouTube channel, which has the super exciting recordings of the calls.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, of course. And do feel free to share with anyone who you think might find this remotely interesting. They are just, there is no editing done on them. It's just whatever is said on the call, that's what's there. Okay, so last week we sort of got to discussing the textual statements or descriptions pattern. So one of the things that we noted during the American Art Collaborative, and indeed with our work here at the Getty, is that we have an awful lot of data that, while it might have some topic, is essentially just a string. So it could be the material statement oil on canvas, which you might be able to parse out as an oil material and a canvas material, and using a bunch of implicit knowledge, you might know that canvas, oil on canvas, implies that there is a part of the painting, which is the support, and that is made of canvas. So you could parse that out into actual data in the model, but while it works for something simple like oil on canvas, there's a lot of decorative arts objects or modern art objects where this would just be completely impossible. I'm sure everyone can imagine their favorite highly decorated desk and chair set from the 16th century or something, with lots of different types of wood and metals and inlays and other associated objects, where the material statement in the database is hundreds of words long, and while it might be understandable by a human, turning it into actual data would be either very difficult or totally pointless, because no system would be able to actually do anything with that data. So with that observation, we noticed, of course, that this occurs very generally. There's the description of the resource, material statements for objects, attribution statements about who should be credited, biographies, dimensions, etc., etc., etc. And thus we thought, well, we'll have we should come up with a pattern for doing this. And the pattern that we have is a linguistic object that has now symbolic content of the actual string of the description, and then it has types as to what sort of description it is. So here it's a material statement, which is the notion of AAT 300 blah blah blah. So if we go to that, then it's materials. So by then saying, okay, we have a brief text, and it's about materials, it's got this content, and it refers to the resource, which is the painting, we can know that this is the material statement. As with any linguistic object, it can have language, it could be created by someone, and so forth. That then gives us sort of the escape route, if you will, for data that is either impossible, too complicated, or not worthwhile reconciling and turning into real data, but just to record it as a string so that then either in the future it's not lost, and in the meantime, or forever, it can be displayed to people as part of a user interface.
Rob, can I ask if it's possible to attach a timestamp to such a statement? If somebody, comes later on and says, actually, it's not oil, it's acrylic or something like that, about the same object?
We haven't talked about that yet, but I guess the question in response would be, do you mean to say that the previous statement was incorrect, or do you mean to say, would you mean just to record that a new statement was made? So there's two possible routes. We could use an attribute assignment to say that the linguistic object blah 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 refers to this particular resource. Equally, we could just put a creation event on the linguistic object to say when it was created, but they have subtly different implications. So a creation on the linguistic object would be, imagine, to make the distinction, imagine that it was cut and paste out of a textbook. The creation would be from the creation of the textbook, as opposed to from the curator that did the assignment, and that would be attribute assignment then. So I think having the use cases for that would be good.
Yeah. Okay.
What was the rationale for wanting to record the sort of the provenance of the statement?
Yeah, so the rationale dictates what route one might take in a case like that. Yeah. Okay.
It does connect to my interest, and I'm not sure how many practical needs there are out there, but in provenance research, to attaching specific historical descriptions of the object in the same space or area as the current description of the object, even if the old descriptions are incorrect.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Do other people have this sort of use case?
That use case is definitely around, yes.
Yeah. Let me ask one more question, which is, do you want to say that this statement was written at this time, or do you want to say that this statement applies to the object at this time, which again is subtly different? So for example, the night watch in the Rijksmuseum was cut down, I forget exactly when, Saskia, the 1600s, to fit, I think, to fit into the building that it was put in. So it would have a different dimension statement, which would be correct before that, and from the dimension statement today. Or equally, if you reframed a painting from one frame to another, and they weren't exactly the same size, the dimension statement would also change. So it's not that the creation of the statement is the interesting part, it's the date range over which that statement is correct that's interesting.
And to a certain extent, that applies to title statements, well, pretty much every aspect of the work,
yes.
Let alone material.
Correct. For example, at the Rijksmuseum, we're closely looking into some of the titles of anonymous works that have gotten a title over time that prove to be a little bit sensitive if you look at it with current eyes. So those titles tend to have a certain duration that is being changed and reviewed at a moment. So you would then be able to keep different titles that you had historically attached to the work. And there's a change that you want to record as well.
Yeah. Yes, we have that exact use case as well. The painting now known as the abduction of Europa used to be known as the rape of Europa, but at some point, I forget exactly when, it was softened in terms of the title. So we would want to be able to record both of those. And yeah, indeed, this seems like, this is a very common thing for practically any piece of information, that data can change over time, whether it's a statement about the work or actual data about the work, a title, contribution of different different creators over time, and so on. Okay, so we do have a pattern for a general pattern, which we will get to in due course, for that, called a phase, which we're working with a CRM extension called CRM SOC, to try to align that with other work around the domain. But yes, for the meantime, it's an extension that we've added, which we'll get to. Are there any questions about the statement pattern, and other than the very good discussion we just had?
Well, I was interested in the thing that you were saying about titles, saying, for example, at the Zero Foundation, we have several concurrent titles for the same artwork that are like the attributed title or the traditional title, or a title that actually come from some source that they specify in their data. So that would be interesting as well, because I remember I once I heard a speech of Antoine saying that, for example, it's really hard to distinguish in the Europeana collection the same artworks that are named differently, like the Gioconda or the Mona Lisa are the same, but if you look for that in Europeana, you won't find all of them. That's because they are not reconciled. And maybe I think it's nice to think about it.
Yep. Yes, definitely. And I think
so that would mean like adding another type statement, like classifying again.
Yeah, almost. I think we will come to this call after partitioning under the sort of identity notion of objects.
Okay.
So let's keep going. So the third sort of major pattern that we saw being used over and over again was partitioning resources. So you can have different measurements for the size of different parts of an object, or different materials for parts of the object, different members in a group, different periods within a larger period of time, and so on and so forth. So in the definition of the profile, we rely heavily on this notion of part and whole, whereas other profiles sometimes take a different approach. So, for example, just to look at a painting which is made of watercolor paint on a support made of canvas, so watercolors on canvas, we have the whole painting has the material watercolors, and then the painting has a part, e.g. it's composed of a part, which is the canvas support, so it's classified as a support, and the support is made of canvas. Equally, perhaps a simpler scenario for provenance for Jonathan. If you've got an auction, then you have an activity which is the entire auction, and it's partitioned up into different lots being sold. So you might get through, I don't know how many, 50 lots in a day, and the auction lasts for 3 days with 150 lots altogether. We could then use the same partitioning pattern for aligning one activity with another without having to go to specific properties for auctions versus other activities. Similarly, locations, cities are part of countries, the gallery place is part of the museum place, and so on and so on. And texts. So another example from the provenance space, if you have the ledger of an art dealer and it's got 100 pages, each of which has 25 rows on a page, you might want to say that a particular row refers to a particular object. So, and that row is part of the page or is part of the book, part of the ledger. So you could have a linguistic object, which is the content of the ledger, which has a part, which is the linguistic object that's the content of the row. Similarly for types and so on and so forth. So whenever we have the sort of need to specialize something, instead of looking for alternate predicates, the first port of call is often to say, if we were to make a part of that thing, would it be accurate to say, that the row is part of the book or the frame is part of the painting? And if that solves the problem, then we have tended to use that as much as possible as a consistent way of modeling, even if there are other approaches. Okay, any questions or thoughts around this topic before we move on to more sort of concrete modeling questions and discussion around objects? No, okay. So, objects. So, almost to Marlena's point. First of all, rather than titles, we have this notion of identifiers. And of course, it being linked data, the primary identifier for an object is the URI at which the description is made available. So, which is given in ID. So here we have linked art example object 45, which is an identifier for that object. And when you dereference it, you get a description of the object. Lovely. So that's a little bit cheating because that's not what most systems today would think of as an identifier. Most systems manage accession numbers or repository numbers and so on, rather than the URI of the linked data. But it's worth putting it up front and saying, we have identified it. So for these other types of identifiers, it's going to use all of the previous base patterns. So here's our lovely example painting. It's identified by an identifier, which has an ID, a type, and a label. It's worth noting that this is the identifier of the identifier rather than the identifier itself. And the identifier, the content of the identifier is, in this case, X198093. To know what sort of identifier, e.g. this is the accession number, we can then use the classification or typing route to say this is classified as an accession number, And I need to fix my website script that auto links AAT. But you can then dereference the type and see, indeed, this is accession numbers. Similarly, it could be a local repository number, which has the value of 677, and a different classification, which says that it's a local number, local repository number. So, Marilena, I imagine you will see very quickly how we would use this exact same pattern for titles. One question to the group, though, is what sort of identifiers do we all use? I imagine most organizations have accession numbers, and that most organizations have some sort of local repository specific or data collection management system specific number or identifier. But if there is a set of classifications, sort of types that we can find commonality across, that would be really valuable, such that we all end up using the same classifications rather than either looking in AAT and finding that there isn't one and inventing a new one, or just picking different possible concepts from AAT. Probably with 25 people on the call, not worth going around the table, but perhaps as homework, if we could maybe send to the Google group, to the email list, here are the identifier types that we use, and we could compare and see which ones are going to be useful to specify in the model directly, and which ones are very specific to a particular institution or a particular data set, and aren't worth, from the perspective of interoperability, aren't worth documenting. Does that sound like something that we could all try and do?
Sure, absolutely.
Sure. Can I ask Rob, presumably this is only for museum identifiers and we don't want to get bogged down in archives and library?
That is a very pertinent question. Let's stick to objects first rather than texts, because there is any number of crazy, wacky library based identifiers that
yes,
we would instantly get swamped with.
Something else, just to point out to this pattern, the classification block is an array and is always an array. So there's not, each identifier doesn't have to have only one kind of classification. So if you end up in your local system having different, like accession number and legacy accession number and current accession number, you can use both a more generic term for interoperability and a more specific term for your own internal needs. You can have as many classifications per identifier as you need. So this way, because where these get used are both for interoperability, so that we can see my accession number is the same as your accession number, which is why using something like AAT is valuable. But this is also when it comes time to use this data, and you want to say, I want to display this particular identifier in this particular space. This classification tends to be the way that you filter through all the possible identifiers to choose the one that you want. And so this lets us overload that idea of to multiply identify things for different reasons, some of which can be only relevant to your application or your particular data model.
Yes, thank you, David. That's an extremely important point. Yes, indeed, and I would even avoid the use of the word overloading. It's just simply adding in additional information that is known that wouldn't collide with other bits of information. So yeah.
can you have multiple identifiers? At the Met, our accession numbers are not unique. We have duplicate numbers, so we rely on our collections management system internal ID, which wouldn't mean anything to the outside world, but it is that's the unique identifier for us.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about the way that the CRM pattern works is that the content, so here, this number, X1988093, can indeed be duplicated by other identifiers. And the identity of the identifier is given here, so 7, which is mostly meaningless. So in terms of, can this content be used to identify multiple things? Yes, absolutely.
I think actually if the other answer to this is that, yes, you can have as many identifiers as you need. So in this example, we have 2 identifiers, both for the same object. This is why we use classifications to let us tell what kind of identifier it is, but you can have as many identifiers as you need. And as long as they each have a unique URL, you've got no problem.
Yeah, so the first one is identifier with the identifier of 7, and this one, the second identifier is 8. But you could have this one, first one is the accession number, and the second one could also be an accession number, both of which identify the painting. Or you know, at which point you might want to also classify the second one as legacy accession number or something, as David pointed out before. Also, yeah, you can have the same content in different identifier blocks applied to different objects for the non-unique identifiers, which then quickly become names.
Rob, could I ask a question? Kevin will remember that we had various discussions in Oxford about the way that we produce the URIs for the different entities. And as I see the examples over here, I was wondering if you had any discussions on how best to structure these URIs. It came to me now as we were talking about multiple identifiers, and you know, the URIs would very quickly become complicated.
Yep. To structure these URIs, which I'm highlighting on the screen. Yeah. So, yeah, we haven't. There's a bunch of best practice documents floating around the linked open data space as to how best to do it, and of course they all disagree with each other. So in our discussions, there have been 2 concerns which lead to different answers. One is the URI ever going to be expected to be seen by a person? And if so, then it should be reasonably human friendly. So, example identifier 8. You know, you can see that it's probably some sort of identifier, and it's got this incrementing number, and it's something in this example space. So for high-level URI patterns here, we've talked about having the program that the originating dataset is from. So if the provenance index at the Getty is in the Getty Research Institute, but there are, of course, many objects referred to from that dataset in the museum, which would then have a different base URI. So at that point it becomes tricky, of course, because now you have 2 different URIs that you need to reconcile. So the other approach is to simply have everything given an opaque UUID, which is the route that our information management system Arches takes, and essentially be damned with human readability. So I think from at least the discussions at the Getty and at some of my previous organizations, it comes down to a policy question of what people are comfortable with rather than any technological decision. That most organizations, in my experience, want to have at least some sort of branding in the URI rather than just this big, long, opaque number. And most developers, which is the target audience for this data, want to have some sort of hint as to what they could find at the end of it. So yeah, thus in the examples, everything, all of the URIs follow this sort of pattern, being host name, data set, which is the examples, then an overall type for it, and then a number, an opaque number. So you know that it's an identifier, you know that it's example, and it happens to be 8. Equally, if I scroll down, titles have the same pattern. It's in the example data set, but it's a name.
I will say from the standard perspective, there is no requirement that URLs have any pattern. This is really from a technical point of view, it doesn't matter what your URL is. What we're really talking about here are, as Rob said, policy about what is a best practice, what is the way that works best for your institution and your needs. The entire system is designed so that the computer should never have to care about what the words or the values in that ID is. It's just from the computer's perspective and from the standards perspective, it's a opaque ID that you can dereference, usually.
So I think that makes a lot of sense from the spec point of view and from the standard point of view. I think Thanasis is right to sort of relay the question that comes up. I think everyone in this group will probably get that and will understand it. But in terms of wider adoption beyond this group, perhaps something that would be really helpful would be to collate amongst ourselves those policies which are definitely going to be local, but the ones that work for developers and have flown politically within the institution, and maybe gather a separate document of here's a cookbook, here are some patterns that have worked in these institutions. We'd recommend you use them as starting points, because it quickly gets out of hand and can actually be a blocker for adopting these kind of APIs.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Yeah. Also, one further addition is sometimes it will depend on the underlying information management system as to what URIs it can possibly expose. If you're just putting files on a hard drive and running Apache, which is essentially how the Linked Art website works, then you have full control. If you have a collection management system that happens to implement this, then it may be entirely out of your control as to what those URIs are.
Yeah, and I'd actually suggest that having those written down as recipes is even more important, because it will give people confidence if they're using those CMSs that they can do this easily because someone else has done it.
Has already done it, indeed. Yep. Great. Any further questions or discussion, or shall we keep going? Keep going down. Dave asks in the chat, can an ID be repeated for multiple identifier types? E.g., can the same URI be used for accession numbers, local repository numbers, or it's a violation? So, Dave, do you mean that which?
Yeah, that one. Right. So if I wanted to convey that I had 2 IDs, but really they were pointing to the same underlying concept, can I use the same literal ID or the same URI for the ID in both that line and the line? Yeah.
No. So that would end up, if you tried to compact it or to interact with it in a graph, all of the information here would be duplicated here, and hence you would have a single identifier that had two labels, accession number and local repository number. It had two contents, x19893 and 677, and two types, accession numbers and local numbers. So yeah, in order to to have multiple identifiers, yeah, you need to have, they would each need to have separate identities at this layer.
Okay, but the resolvability of them, I mean, you could just, if you were using some kind of RESTful scheme, you could just perhaps append, you know, that 7 with accession number, and then append 7 with repository number, and that might not result in any difference when if you wanted to access and make that URI resolvable, but it would be unique in terms of satisfying the requirement.
Yeah. So if it's a repository number and an accession number, you could simply delete that chunk and have it be classified as an accession number and a local number.
Ah, okay, got it.
Which is probably the easier route. Yeah. Anything can have, which is, as David said, is hinted at by the fact that it's in an array. Whenever there's the possibility of multiple values, even if the example only has one, it's an array with a single value rather than the value itself. So, in this case, for classified, it will have, you could have multiple classifications, as we do here. So the object itself as a painting was super useful for knowing what sort of thing it is, but also it's an artwork, which is even more general, of course, than painting. The reason for putting this guy in, comes from the decorative arts area domain, where you might have something which is type chair or type table, and you want to, in the same room, have chairs for people to sit on to look at the other chairs. And some of them are art and some of them are just chairs. So hence having this distinction between artwork, things that are considered art and things that are not considered art, even if they have the same other types, was important. For reasons of time, and because there is this lovely warning here that we're going to change this, I'm going to skip over contexts, and we'll come back to them, probably in phases. But the notion here is essentially what we were talking about earlier, that identifiers often come from a particular context. So just because, so if you imagine a painting is owned by one institution and is then sold at auction to a different institution, and we have information about the identifiers at each of those 3 steps, we would not want to lose those identifiers, but we would want to know either what time frame they're associated with, or what context they came from. So the original collector's identifier versus the museum or archive where the object ended up would be a particularly useful one. And in both cases, they'll have accession numbers. So you want to know whose accession number it is. I'm not going to talk about the solution because it uses a pattern that I think we're going to try and get away from, and would be good to discuss on a separate call, certainly not in 5 minutes. I definitely do want to get to titles. So to Marilena's question, like identifiers, objects of all sorts, but in this case, artworks, will have different names at different times and different contexts, or even just at the same time. So we have, label, which is intended for developers, and there's an issue that we raised after last call that had really good discussion, and we will come back to it, about perhaps making it underscore label or something to make it even clearer that this is metadata, metadata other than metadata. So the actual name is in an identified by block, and this is also why it's interesting from the modeling perspective. It uses exactly the same property, p1 identified by, as other identifiers. So to Jeannie's question about multiple identifiers, it's exactly the same as for names. And clearly objects can have multiple names. So instead of having an identifier, the type is name. And as of very recently, as we discussed last time, we've added this E33, E41 linguistic appellation so that it can have content, peasant and sheep, and language and other, both naming and linguistic properties. This name is then classified as a primary name, and if you dereference that one, it says primary terms. So you know that the primary name of this object is peasant and sheep. Alternate names, so maybe the primary name is self-portrait, but it has another name, portrait of the artist. So this is again where the array comes in. You'd have the object is identified by two names. One is self-portrait, which is the primary name, and there's another name, which is portrait of the artist.
But sorry, Robert, but in this case, you don't classify it, right?
Yeah, there's no classification on this guy. It could be. There's nothing that would prevent it, of course. You wouldn't want to say it was the primary name.
Sure.
But
and then alternate names, that whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
But
though,
anyway, we are allowed. I mean, now I don't remember by heart the Getty vocabulary, but I guess there are like terms to say it's an alternate name or maybe a traditional title or something like that, because that's my only point. Like we need official names that are the primary names, and attributed names and traditional names.
Yep.
Maybe we can look for that.
Yes. Yep. Those all sound super valuable.
And I think what we keep saying is that if there are reoccurring patterns that we see in our work that are not an AAT, we can work with AAT to add them. And if there are particular classifications that are local to your institution, it's also equally valid for you to create your own classification with your own ID that is not an AAT and just use that.
Yeah, I thought about that. But otherwise you are comfortable to add new terms to the AAT?
Yeah, definitely. If there is multiple
bunch of people,
multiple institutions who have a need, then absolutely. I will work with the vocabularies folk, and we've even just with our own institution and with different data sets, we've run into the same sorts of concepts and needed identifiers for them, and they've been very happy to add them. So that should be no problem at all.
So mine is a call for other cases. If anybody else has the same issue, please speak now.
Yep. Yeah, and perhaps if we expanded the homework to be both identifiers and titles, would be a valuable exercise. And that's it, really. There's also types, of course, which we've already talked about. It's a sculpture or a painting. But those are the two ways that we essentially identify our objects, either by identifier, which are non-linguistic, or by name, which are linguistic. I note that I should have an example with both an identifier and a name to demonstrate that they both fall under this identified by property, which I will do. Right. Any last questions or comments or discussion? Otherwise, it's the top of the hour. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you very much to George for taking the notes. And yeah, look forward to another call in a couple of weeks, same time and same place.
Hey Rob, before you close, quickly, I'm sure you can find it somewhere, but what are the start times and end times of the face-to-face meeting?
Oh, that is a good question. We hope to be able to start at 9 a.m. And the end will be sort of, well, it'll be different on the different days. The first day will be quite late because we'll be out at the villa. So we'll probably be back to the hotel more like 7 o'clock. Or back to the area near the centre. But then the other day, on Tuesday, we'll finish about 5:30. And on Wednesday, we'll finish 2 o'clock, 2:30, so that people can get flights.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, I have to go for another meeting, but thank you, Rob.
Yep, great. Thanks, everyone. I will post the recording as soon as my little laptop can generate it. Right. Bye all.